Listen closely because what I'm about to tell you is something you were never meant to hear. In the spring of 1834, a sheriff forced open a cellar door on a quiet Virginia farm and found 67 children chained in the dark. They were emaciated, scarred, and silent except for the faint whispers of one name that clung to their trembling lips: Mother Sullivan. That discovery was never meant to be remembered. The reports were buried, the officers who saw it broke under the weight of what they witnessed, and the story was scrubbed from history as if it had never happened. But you and I were going to walk down those stairs together. And once you hear what was waiting beneath that farmhouse, you will never look at the world the same way again. Because this is not just the story of one twisted family. It is the story of how power hides its filth in plain sight, how entire communities become blind, and how innocence is devoured under the smiling face of false charity. This is the Sullivan family, the basement of Virginia, the place where 67 children vanished into silence, and where the truth about how institutions manipulate the human mind begins to bleed through. You were not supposed to know this, but now you do. At first glance, the Sullivan family appeared no different from any other landowning couple in rural Virginia. Their white farmhouse sat on the edge of rolling fields, the porch painted bright, the smoke from the chimney steady and reassuring. Constance Sullivan was remembered by neighbors as soft-spoken, devout, and charitable, a woman who always claimed to be caring for orphans left destitute by tragedy. Her husband Ezra, descended from tobacco wealth, was known for his quiet industry and his tireless expansion of the property's basement. To the community of Millbrook, the Sullivans were good Christians performing works of mercy. And that is how evil survives, not by looking like a monster, but by wearing the mask of virtue. For 2 decades, the Sullivans perfected their illusion. Every purchase of extra food explained away. Every whispered cry muffled beneath hymns of piety. Letters shown to the pastor, proof of relatives who did not exist, reassured the faithful that the children were merely passing through. And the community men and women who prided themselves on honor and neighborly watchfulness accepted it all without question. Because it is easier to believe in goodness than to confront corruption that walks in your midst. Do you see the pattern? This is not just about 1834 Virginia. This is how power still works today. It hides in plain sight, dressed in the language of morality, cloaked in the illusion of charity, while beneath the surface, the chains rattle. The neighbors saw glimpses, small faces peering from wagon windows, eyes wide and hollow. They heard hammering at midnight, muffled sounds rising from the earth. Yet none dared to press harder. Because to accuse the righteous is to risk exile. To pierce the veil is to invite the wrath of a community bound not by truth, but by silence. And that silence was the Sullivans' greatest weapon. Think carefully about this. When entire towns can be bent into blindness, when fear of asking the wrong question outweighs the reality of suffering children, who truly holds the power? Is it the one chaining the innocent, or the system that makes it possible to chain them for decades without interference? This is why the Sullivan basement matters. It was not just a hidden crime. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting a truth that most men are too weak to face. Evil thrives not because it is hidden well, but because we are trained not to look too closely. The illusion began to splinter in the early months of 1834. It did not shatter all at once, it cracked slowly, like ice groaning under hidden weight. The first fracture came when a traveling merchant, Jacob Stern, was caught in a blizzard and forced to seek shelter at the Sullivan farmhouse. Ezra could not refuse him. Virginia custom demanded hospitality to a stranger in danger. That night, Stern lay awake on a makeshift bed in their parlor. The Sullivans were courteous, but restless, exchanging nervous glances with every sound. And beneath the floorboards, faint and muffled, Stern heard something he could not explain, what he swore was the crying of children. Ezra dismissed it as wind howling through the stones, but the sound followed Stern into his dreams and lingered long after he left. He had brushed against the forbidden, and like most men, he chose silence. The second fracture came weeks later. A young Irish immigrant girl, Mary Catherine Flynn, separated from her family on the road, sought refuge at the farm. She was never seen again. Her family's pleas were drowned in the wilderness of Virginia, their voices lost to the bureaucracy of a sheriff's office that considered disappearance a natural hazard of frontier life. One missing girl was no cause for alarm. But it was not one, it was dozens. And every vanished child left behind only whispers, a faint trail that always ended at the Sullivan farm. The final fracture came on an April evening, when a farmer named William Hutchinson paused in the woods by the Sullivan property. He thought he heard laughter at first. But it was not laughter, it was screaming. Not the wild shrieks of children at play, but ragged, desperate cries that clawed through the trees. Hutchinson crept closer, heart pounding, and watched as Ezra emerged from a cellar door, chains and locks glinting in the lantern light. Ezra looked around nervously before slipping back underground. Hutchinson knew then that something unnatural festered beneath that house. These three incidents, seemingly unconnected, were the cracks through which light bled into the darkness. But remember this, the Sullivan secret might have remained buried even then. The sheriff himself dismissed the stories as gossip, the idle suspicions of fearful neighbors. And this is the lesson that should terrify you. Evil is not defeated by discovery alone. It is defeated only when men refuse to look away. Most never do. That is why basements like the Sullivans exist in every age, in every nation, wearing 1,000 different faces. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Benjamin Crawford rode out to the Sullivan property with his deputy Marcus Webb. To them, it was routine, little more than a duty to quiet gossip before it spread further. Millbrook was a small town. Rumors, if left unchecked, corroded trust. Crawford expected to find nothing more sinister than a few thin orphans in need of bread. He had no idea he was about to step onto the threshold of something that would haunt him until his dying breath. Constance Sullivan greeted them at the door. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. She offered coffee, explained the gossip as cruel misunderstandings, and even produced letters fabricated, but convincing, supposedly from relatives arranging homes for the children. Everything about her performance radiated respectability. To any casual observer, the matter might have ended there. But Deputy Webb excused himself to walk the property. And that decision sealed the Sullivans' fate. On the far side of the house, Webb saw it. A cellar door, bolted shut with 3 heavy padlocks, chains snaked across the handles. The wood itself was scarred, deep claw marks torn from the inside out. His stomach twisted. He returned to Crawford in silence, leaned in, and whispered what he had seen. And in that instant, the atmosphere shifted. The sheriff looked again at Constance Sullivan, her trembling hands, the sudden pallor on her face, and knew the truth she had hidden for decades was pressing against the very floorboards beneath their boots. Then came the sound. Faint at first, barely audible. The soft whimper of a child rising through the cracks in the kitchen floor. A voice, weak but unmistakable, pleading for help. Crawford froze. The air thickened with something unspeakable. The cries multiplied, muffled sobs, a chorus of suffering swelling from the earth itself. For the first time in his career, Crawford felt his knees weaken. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, could no longer mask the tremor in his hands. When Crawford demanded access to the cellar, Constance's mask cracked. She stammered excuses about danger, broken equipment, disease. But her words could not drown out the voices clawing upward from the darkness. In that moment, the lie collapsed. Understand this. What the sheriff was about to uncover was not just crime. It was a blueprint of control, a hidden architecture designed with precision. The Sullivans had not simply imprisoned children, they had built a system, a machine of despair, perfected over 2 decades. And that machine was waiting just below their feet. The sound of iron shattering against iron still haunted Sheriff Crawford until the day he died. When his men pried those padlocks open, the first thing that struck them was the stench and odor so dense it seemed to have weight. Human waste, sweat, disease, and something worse. A smell he later described as the odor of despair itself. It rolled out of the cellar in a thick wave, making even hardened deputies gag. Crawford forced himself down the steps first, lantern trembling in his hand. The light revealed stone walls carefully mortared, sealed to muffle sound stretching far beyond the footprint of the farmhouse. This was no simple root cellar. It was an underground labyrinth, designed with intention. And chained to its walls were children, 67 of them. Their eyes reflected the lantern light like glass. Wide, hollow, unblinking. The silence was unbearable. After the first cries for help, they had fallen quiet, staring at the officers as though rescue were impossible, as though hope itself had long been beaten out of them. Their small bodies were emaciated, ribs jutting through tattered rags. Shackles around their ankles connected to iron rings embedded deep into stone. Each chain long enough to shuffle a few steps but never far enough to touch another human being. It was a design that stripped them not only of freedom, but of the possibility of comfort. Deputy Webb, a father himself, broke first. He staggered back up the steps to vomit, gasping for air. Crawford pressed deeper, lanterns sweeping across rooms connected like cells in a hive. Each chamber was worse than the last. Buckets overflowing, straw bedding blackened with rot, the faint sound of chains dragging when a child dared to shift. And still, not a single voice rose to greet them. The silence was not natural. It was learned, conditioned, beaten into them until even the instinct to cry was dangerous. Crawford would later write in a private note never published, hidden in archives, that what he saw was not chaos, but method. Every wall, every shackle, every ration of food had been calculated. This was not madness. This was structure, organization. The children had been reduced to raw material, as though they were being prepared for something far beyond the comprehension of a small-town sheriff. Understand this: what lay beneath that farmhouse was not only a crime against children, it was a glimpse of how power experiments with control, hidden behind the mask of charity. The Sullivans were not improvising. They were executing a design that should make you ask, who taught them? Sheriff Crawford thought the worst was over once he saw the children chained in the cellar. But he was wrong. The horror wasn't only in the bodies, it was in the design. Everywhere he looked, he found signs of order. Crude chalk marks scratched into stone walls. Tallies of days, feeding rotations, punishments. Wooden shelves stacked with ledger books, carefully written records in the Sullivan family's own hand. These weren't diaries of madness. They were accounts, lists of arrivals, notes on obedience, even calculations of usefulness. Crawford turned the brittle pages with shaking fingers. Each child reduced to an entry in age, a weight, a note scrawled in cold precision, too weak, docile, rebellious. The Sullivan farmhouse had masqueraded as a sanctuary, yet here, beneath the earth, was proof it was nothing more than a processing station. And then he noticed something that chilled him deeper than anything else: the silence. Not a single child dared to cry out, even as deputies broke their chains. Their faces twitched when touched, but no screams, no sobs, no words escaped their lips. Crawford realized this was not the silence of relief, it was the silence of conditioning. These children had been trained into stillness, their voices stripped away until obedience became their only survival. How long does it take to teach a child not to weep? To erase the most basic human instinct? Crawford understood, in that suffocating moment, that what he had found wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a system of control. And when he ordered his men to search the rest of the property, what they uncovered made the sheriff's blood run colder. Caches of forged documents, donation letters stamped with official seals, correspondence with names and institutions far beyond Rainswood County. This wasn't just a family operation, it was supported, or at the very least protected, by someone with reach. Someone who ensured that dozens of children could vanish from the orphanage without a single state inspector asking questions. What the sheriff had stumbled into wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening act of something far more sinister. The cellar was only the visible scar. The disease ran much deeper. When Sheriff Crawford dragged the surviving Sullivan family members into the light, he expected resistant screams, denials, maybe even pleas for mercy. What he got instead was worse. The eldest, Margaret Sullivan, sat with her wrists bound, her posture regal, as if she were hosting a Sunday tea rather than awaiting arrest. Her face was stern, emotionless, and her voice carried a conviction that unsettled even the deputies who had wrestled her from the cellar. "You think you've done those children a kindness?" she asked, her words sharp and measured. "They'll wither in your world. Out there they are nothing. Here they had purpose." Crawford slammed his fist on the table, demanding answers, but Margaret never flinched. She spoke with the chilling detachment of someone convinced of her righteousness. For her, this wasn't cruelty, it was order. Her brother, Thomas, offered little more than a sneer. "You call it slavery. We call it discipline. Children without family, without name, without future. Society throws them away. We gave them structure." It was that word structure that burrowed into Crawford's mind like a thorn. The Sullivan family didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as custodians, architects of a twisted system where obedience was the highest virtue. When pressed about the forged documents and donation letters, Margaret's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "You think Rainswood is unique?" she whispered. "We are but one house, one root in a much older tree." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, but Crawford leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "Who else? Who funds you?" Margaret's eyes glimmered with something that was not fear, but pride. "You'll never understand, Sheriff. You've only seen the cellar. You haven't seen the cathedral." The room fell silent. For the first time, Crawford realized the Sullivans weren't merely eccentric zealots operating in isolation. They were part of something larger, something organized, something hidden in plain sight. And Margaret Sullivan, bound and bloodied, smiled like she had already won. The cellar should have been a place of relief once the children were carried out, but instead, it became a mirror of something far darker than anyone in Rainswood had ever witnessed. First, there was silence. Not a single child cried when deputies lifted them into the daylight. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if the sun itself was something foreign, something forbidden. One girl, no older than 6, shielded her face with trembling hands, whispering, "The light burns! The light burns!" Another boy, his ribs jutting through paper-thin skin, crawled rather than walked, his body twisted from years of being forced to kneel for hours on stone floors. Some children clung desperately to one another, moving in unison like frightened animals, while others obeyed invisible commands, pausing mid-step, tilting their heads, or muttering chants in a language only they understood. But what unnerved Sheriff Crawford most was their obedience. When Margaret Sullivan, still bound and being dragged to the wagon, lifted her head and hissed, "Kneel!" Nearly half the children dropped instantly to their knees, their faces slack, their eyes glazed. It took 3 deputies to pull them back up, shaking and shouting to break the spell. Doctors who later examined the children found scars on their backs shaped like deliberate patterns, whip marks carved with almost surgical precision. Some bore brands on their shoulders, crude shapes of crosses, circles, and letters no one could decipher. And every child, without exception, had one thing in common. When asked their name, they hesitated, glanced around nervously, and finally whispered the same chilling phrase, "I am no one." The Sullivans hadn't just stolen their childhoods. They had stolen their very identities, reducing them to faceless servants of a doctrine too vile to name. For the townsfolk of Rainswood, the truth was undeniable. Rescue didn't mean freedom. These children would carry the Sullivans' chains long after the cellar was empty. And for Sheriff Crawford, one question burned louder than ever: if Margaret was right, if Rainswood was only one route, how many more children out there were still kneeling in the dark? When the Sullivan family was brought to trial, the courtroom was packed. Curiosity and revulsion filled the air, and every eye turned to the accused with a mixture of horror and disbelief. But what the townspeople did not yet realize was that this trial would not just expose one family, it would rip open a hidden web that extended far beyond Millbrook. Sheriff Crawford presented his findings first. The cellar, the chains, the ledger books, the meticulous records of abuse. The prosecution laid out the evidence of kidnapping, falsified correspondence, and the suspicious deaths of dozens of children whose disappearances had never been investigated. The crowd gasped at each revelation. Yet even as the horror unfolded, the Sullivans remained composed. Their calm, Their cold detachment was almost theatrical. And then came the letters. Hundreds of pages, carefully hidden in secret compartments. Correspondence with orphanages in Pennsylvania, private benefactors in Richmond, and even clergy in nearby counties. Some letters discuss children in clinical terms: age, health, obedience. Others hinted at financial arrangements, shipments of supplies, and schedules for the rotations of new arrivals. It became painfully clear the Sullivan operation was not isolated. It was part of something far larger, a network of collusion that manipulated the vulnerabilities of the era: poverty, orphanhood, and societal trust. Margaret Sullivan, standing before the judge, smirked faintly when asked to explain the letters. "You think this is merely a family's work," she said, her voice sharp and measured. "But it is the way of the world. Systems like ours always exist, hidden in plain sight. You just haven't been taught to see." Every man in that courtroom felt the weight of her words. Because she was right. The Sullivans had exploited the very mechanisms of authority and trust: the churches, the local officials, the orphanages themselves, to operate undisturbed for over 20 years. And here is the lesson Crawford carried for the rest of his life. Evil does not always wear a mask of darkness. Often, it walks in the light, smiling, shaking hands, and leaving paperwork behind to make it seem legitimate. And most of us never look closely enough to notice. If you think this stops with the Sullivans, you are mistaken. This is the pattern: ancient, repeating, persistent. The horror of the Sullivan operation was never only physical. Chains could be broken, cells could be opened. But the mind was another prison entirely. Crawford observed it in every child. Even those freed from the cellar moved cautiously, speaking only when spoken to, their eyes darting as if expecting punishment for words they hadn't yet spoken. The Sullivans had perfected a system of obedience rooted in terror and repetition, a psychological architecture designed to erase identity. They used cycles of fear and reward. A child obedient for a day might receive a crust of bread or a kind word. Disobedience or even the faintest hesitation brought isolation, deprivation, or worse. Over years, months, decades, the children learned that nothing was random. Every movement, every glance, every sound was monitored. The result was silent submission, a learned helplessness so complete that even freedom felt dangerous. But the Sullivans went further. They fractured the children against one another. Friendships were discouraged, alliances punished. Each child existed in a bubble of fear, unable to trust anyone, not even themselves. In this way, the family-ensured control was not just enforced, it was internalized. Each child became their own jailer. Crawford saw the signs of identity erasure most clearly in their speech. When asked their name, nearly every child responded with, "I am no one," a simple phrase repeated so often that it became a mantra. Margaret Sullivan had drilled it into them, a symbolic death of self, leaving only a hollow shell capable of compliance. Even their emotions were managed. Joy, anger, curiosity, these instincts were suppressed through systematic punishment. Laughter was dangerous. Tears were dangerous. Eye contact could provoke a shackle or a slap. In the Sullivans' world, life itself was a series of tests, and failure was unthinkable. This is what makes the Sullivan story far more than an isolated crime. It is a demonstration of power, of control, of the ways human systems can be manipulated to bend the minds of the innocent. And the terrifying truth? This is not unique. Every era, every culture, has its hidden cellars, its silent lessons, its children taught to obey. By the time Crawford left the trial and walked the sunlit streets of Millbrook, he understood the gravity of the lesson. Freedom is not given. It must be reclaimed. The more Sheriff Crawford examined the Sullivan operation, the more he realized a horrifying truth. This family was not an anomaly. Their methods, the chains, the cellars, the psychological conditioning, mirrored techniques used by institutions designed to control, to manipulate, to dominate. The Sullivans had borrowed from the playbook of the powerful. They understood human obedience. They observed the way schools, orphanages, and even churches trained compliance. They perfected these techniques in secret, adapting ancient lessons in discipline and submission to their private kingdom underground. What Crawford found most disturbing was the networked aspect of the operation. Letters, payments, and exchanges hinted at complicity outside the farm. Individuals in positions of trust had turned a blind eye or worse, actively facilitated the disappearance of children. They had institutional cover. The Sullivans weren't acting alone. They were a node in a hidden system that fed on silence, obedience, and fear. And then there was the pattern of recruitment. Children from distant towns, lured with promises of work, food, or refuge, were brought in quietly. Local authorities accepted explanations, orphans needing care, temporary arrangements, because the system was designed to look benevolent. Crawford realized that the illusion of morality was the Sullivans' greatest weapon. Evil concealed as charity, cruelty hidden in plain sight, and the public none the wiser. The children's broken minds became evidence of methodical training. Each act of compliance, each whisper of submission, was a testament to the efficacy of psychological control. It wasn't random abuse. It was a system perfected for power, a formula that could be replicated wherever oversight was weak and trust unexamined. Crawford began to understand the most chilling implication. The Sullivans' house was a microcosm. It reflected what could and often did exist in larger societal structures. Institutions that promised protection sometimes became instruments of domination. People who claimed benevolence could hide cruelty behind layers of legitimacy. And the public, eager to believe in charity, was complicit simply by looking away. By the time the trial concluded, Crawford knew one thing with unshakable clarity. Understanding the Sullivans was not enough. One had to see the systems they emulated, the networks they infiltrated, and the silent machinery of control that allowed such horrors to persist unnoticed. Freedom should have felt like salvation, but for the Sullivan children, it was something else entirely. Those who emerged from the cellar carried more than emaciated bodies. They carried shattered minds. Years of conditioning had taught them that movement could be punished, speech could be dangerous, even thought itself could be a crime. Walking in the sun, breathing fresh air, these simple acts ignited terror instead of relief. Many could not speak their own names. "I am no one," they whispered, a mantra drilled so deeply that claiming identity felt impossible. Even when fostered into new homes or placed with relatives, their eyes betrayed the cellar's lessons. Vigilance, suspicion, and constant fear. Normalcy was a foreign language, one they could not parse. Doctors and psychologists of the era were baffled. How do you treat a child who refuses to eat unless given explicit permission? A child who flinches at touch, who whispers to shadows as if expecting punishment. The Sullivan operation had done more than abuse, they had reprogrammed human beings. Some children formed silent alliances, huddling together like animals, instinctively protecting one another from imagined threats. Others became isolated, wandering in public spaces, unresponsive to voices, terrified of contact. Their trauma was permanent, a living proof of how power and cruelty, when systematized, could bend the human psyche to submission. Crawford watched this transformation with a growing, uneasy clarity. He understood something the townsfolk never would. The Sullivans had created not just victims, but instruments of obedience. Their methods were a blueprint, a template for domination. These children were not merely scarred, they were a testament to the efficacy of terror when wielded as a tool of power. And yet, a deeper question lingered in Crawford's mind, haunting him in the quiet hours. If such cruelty could be hidden in one family home, in one rural county, how many more cellars, how many more hidden systems existed elsewhere? How many institutions in broad daylight had perfected the same techniques, masking domination under the guise of morality, charity, or law? The Sullivan children were the answer in microcosm, and their silence, their conditioned obedience was the warning. The Sullivan farmhouse was only the beginning. Sheriff Crawford realized that once you see the machinery of control, you can no longer ignore it. Systems like the Sullivans exist not just in basements, but in plain sight under the guise of schools, orphanages, religious institutions, and bureaucracies. These systems rely on obedience, on the public's willingness to trust authority without question. They exploit vulnerability, manipulate fear, and reward compliance. The Sullivans perfected the formula in isolation, but elsewhere it thrived silently, invisible behind layers of legitimacy. Crawford's investigations revealed troubling patterns: orphanages with missing children, institutions that punished curiosity, and letters that masked transactions in charity. It was the same principle at work, the invisible hand of control, operating methodically, making victims complicit in their own subjugation through fear and learned obedience. The lesson was clear and terrifying: power does not announce itself. It infiltrates, it shapes, it molds. The Sullivans had applied it on a small scale. Across the world, similar systems shape generations. Children trained to obey, adults conditioned to follow, societies structured to tolerate exploitation. The cellar beneath Millbrook was a microcosm, a dark mirror reflecting the architecture of authority itself. And yet, most people never see it. They live their lives under invisible chains, blind to the patterns. Obedience becomes habit. Compliance becomes morality. Fear becomes faith. Crawford understood that the Sullivans were not merely a family of criminals, they were students of human control, and their techniques were eternal, adaptable, and replicable. He could not forget the eyes of the children, empty yet aware, obedient yet broken. He could not unhear the whispers of, "I am no one," and he could not stop thinking, if one family could operate undetected for decades, what else remains hidden today? This is the dangerous knowledge that changes a man once he sees it. Power is not what you think. It hides in generosity, smiles, and authority. It thrives in silence. And those who understand it hold the key to awakening or destruction. Now listen closely. The story of the Sullivans is more than history, it is a warning, a blueprint of human control, and a challenge to every man watching this video. You have seen what secrecy, obedience, and the silent machinery of power can do to the most innocent. You have heard whispers of chains, both physical and invisible, and you understand that the world is never as safe or just as it appears. The children of Millbrook were broken because they were taught to comply, to erase themselves, to become instruments of someone else's will. And if you think that is confined to the past, think again. Systems of control persist in offices, governments, schools, and social structures, often subtle, almost invisible, but no less potent. Compliance, silence, and unquestioned trust are their chains. This is your moment of choice. Awareness is the first step toward liberation. Once you see the patterns, once you understand the mechanisms, you can no longer remain a passive participant. You are being given the dangerous knowledge that others spend a lifetime trying to hide. Use it wisely. And now, to anchor this awakening, I want you to engage not passively, but actively. Comment the phrase, "I break the chains," twice. This is not ritual. It is declaration. It is the recognition that obedience without scrutiny is the enemy of freedom. It is the acknowledgement that knowledge carries responsibility, and that awareness alone is a weapon. Repeat it. Commit it. Let it settle. Those words are more than symbolic, they are your bridge from passive observer to awakened individual. The Sullivans thought they could erase identities, suppress minds, and operate without consequence. But you are learning what they never wanted anyone to know. Their method was perfection in cruelty, yes, but their network depended on the blind, the trusting, and the unaware. Once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you know, you cannot unknow. You have been pulled down the rabbit hole into the forbidden, into truths hidden in plain sight. And now you understand something essential. Awareness is power. Vigilance is liberation. And the chains, whether literal or invisible, exist only where obedience goes unquestioned. Now listen carefully, because this is where the story ends, and yet, it is only the beginning. The Sullivans are gone, their cellar empty, their trial concluded. The children have been placed, some recovered partially, others forever marked. But the truth remains. The system that allowed this atrocity to persist is alive, hidden, and patient. Evil, real and methodical, does not always announce itself with screams or violence. It creeps in disguised as kindness, authority, or necessity. It waits for blind trust, unquestioned obedience, and the silence of those who refuse to look too closely. And once it finds these, it becomes unstoppable. The Sullivan family was merely an experiment in human domination, a blueprint showing how easily innocence can be fractured, how deeply fear can be ingrained, and how power thrives when it is unseen. Consider this carefully. The chains that bound those children were physical, visible, and horrifying. The chains that bind men today are subtler habits, unexamined beliefs, unquestioned authority, fear of the unknown. Yet the principle is identical. The more invisible the chain, the stronger the control. The more obedience without awareness, the deeper the domination. You have seen it. You have heard it. You have glimpsed the machinery behind what most would call normal, everyday life. And now the responsibility is yours. The knowledge you carry is dangerous not because it threatens others, but because it will change you. Once you understand how systems manipulate, how minds are molded, you cannot return to ignorance. Remember the faces of the Sullivan children. Remember the whisper, "I am no one." Let it remind you of what happens when fear becomes law and obedience becomes identity. And know this, you have been given insight that the world rarely permits. You have seen the shadows behind the light, the cracks in the facade of civilization, the hidden patterns that govern compliance. This is the final truth. Power is neither granted nor inherited. It is seized, maintained, and expanded by those who understand it, and destroyed by those who refuse to obey blindly. Be vigilant, question relentlessly, guard your mind, and never forget chains are always waiting, and freedom is always temporary, unless one is awake enough to recognize the hand that would bind you.